Hello, captains. Thank you for being on time. I'm very happy to present to you today our invited guest for February, the one, the only Alexander Grace. I have been a fan of Alexander's work since before I even started Psychax. And one of the things that really intrigued me and drew me to his work is what I believe to be a fairly fair and balanced perspective on intersexual relationships that wasn't really teetered towards um, advancing men's interests at the expense of women. And Alexander's been in the space for a very long time. He's put out thousands of episodes. His content of late has just been fire, and I hope to talk to him about that very briefly. So hopefully you're here because you're also a fan. I've been a personal supporter of his work for many, many years. Thank you for coming on the channel, Alexander. It's really great to have you.
No worries. Pleased to be here.
Right on. So, as it usually goes, captains, I'm going to have a little back and forth with Alexander. And then after a few minutes, I will open it up to the group. So while we're chatting, think of those questions because you'll have to raise your hand and queue up to get Alexander's perspective on your issues. So, as you know, these things tend to queue up very quickly. So if you have something that you definitely want him to weigh in on, have that in your mind and raise your hand when the time comes. Okay, Alexander, again, thanks for being here. You know, is it just me, or has there been kind of a newfound passion in your episodes of late? I've been, you're just killing it on YouTube. Your episodes routinely get over 100,000 views when you upload them. You're doing so good these days. And maybe it's just me, maybe it's my projection, but I feel like there's just an energy with what you're doing these days that I don't remember from years ago. You want to speak to that?
I'm angrier tends to be the tends
Do you
to
think
be
that's
the
true though? Do you feel angrier, or is it just more passionate? That's what I pick up on.
no, I think I'm angrier. But I am also more passionate. The two aren't mutually exclusive. I think when I first started, my mind was a little bit closed in its focus in that I was looking at the world and I was trying to explain to other people how things operate and educate them as to how they can best navigate within that system. And that was the sort of limit of my mind. As I've gotten older, and especially since becoming a father, I feel like my understanding has been quite exponential. And so my scope has widened to include a lot more questions, not just of why are things the way they are, to include things like, well, why aren't things more like this? And then providing my mind with a very clear sense of contrast between how things are and how things could, or dare I argue, should be, has made me more and more angry about the way that things are. I also see it with a lot more clarity. I think when I first started putting my opinions out online, which, if anybody here in the room has ever done, is no small feat of courage. It's difficult to do to allow yourself to be subject to a lot of scrutiny.
Sure.
But I was quite tentative to make sure that I was not saying anything that I couldn't defend. And so I was probably more timid. It's been 7 years or something like that. I'm still waiting for somebody to actually come along and tell me that I'm wrong. I craved it for years. I imagine that there must be a whole host of arguments against what I'm saying and my perspectives. But the longer they go without materializing, the less I feel that need to be timid in expressing what I think. In fact, I almost feel like I'm tempting somebody. I'm going to speak bolder and bolder and bolder and show more of my genuine passion or anger in the hope that at some point somebody will be so pissed off by how wrong I am or something like that, and they'll come and tell me why I'm mistaken in something that I've said. I crave that. So yeah, you're noticing something very real.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because I'm in an episode a while back. I think it's called "The Truth of the Red Pill," and I talk about, let's say, the angry phase that a lot of men go through when they start to learn the truth about, some of the ways the world works, and the truth about intersexual dynamics and how women operate and what they're attracted to and what they get and get away with, and et cetera, et cetera. And if you're an average guy who's tried to play by the rules, it can come as quite a shock. And generally that results in, I think it's unavoidable. I think guys have to get angry and they eventually go through it. My argument is that the anger is still a residue of the red pill not fully being digested. But here you are. I mean, I would think that you've swum in these waters for years. So this seems to be a bit counter to my argument, because I don't think that I'm going to teach you anything about intersexual dynamics that you don't already know, and you're feeling more emboldened to access and express your anger 7 years later. What's that about?
Uh, so I think that there's a danger actually in your perspective that you might be pathologizing what's quite a normal emotion. I don't demonize anger in the way that seems to be implied by your perspective, but I'll also reassure you somewhat that anger is not my everyday experience because largely I've made it out. I was successful in dating. I've been with Emily 15 years. We're very happy. We have a daughter together. But when I sit down to read my emails or when I do private consultations or in my hero circle and I look at the stuff that I need to talk about, it does anger me. And I don't think that I ever want to get to a stage where I look at injustice or suffering and I feel unmoved by it, but I also don't focus on it more than is necessary. Were it not for my job and this being something I'm passionate about, I don't think I would be experiencing this. But the fact that when I see people suffering in this way, it does provoke a sense of anger in me. That doesn't bother me. With regards to your point about people kind of not fully integrating the truth of the world or the red pill, as you put it, and then there being a residue of anger, that is a good way to think about it in the sense of it's guiding you as to what emotional integration you still yet have to do. But I don't think that where I see the danger in what you said, and I'll let you speak to it in a moment, is that if you then make the point that there's something wrong with you for feeling that anger because, oh, you haven't done that work, then you focus on the emotion and potentially feel a little bit ashamed and you move out of it artificially quickly. The correct thing to do, I think, would be to find the appropriate community, perhaps this one, perhaps like the Hero Circle, or even just friends, family in your personal life, to actually get to express some of the suffering that you've been through with that connection so that you use what has been a source of isolation and suffering as a motivator to actually reach out and connect to people and receive validation for the things that you've been through.
I think that's very well said, and your point is taken. I think I wouldn't go so far to say that I pathologize anger, but I do see it in a negative light, in the sense that it's usually a suboptimal response to the iniquities of the world. But I do think there is a point that maybe nothing gets done until someone gets angry. Like it took Gandhi getting thrown off the train to stand up and support, Indian rights against the British regime, right? So maybe there is a point in which anger is actually very healthy, normal, and fruitful to propel people towards constructive action.
So I don't know the specific video that you're referencing, so I apologize if I've lost some
Okay.
nuance in what you've said, but can I ask, like, aren't you just a bit sick of male anger being demonized by the culture to the degree that it is? Because I am. Personally, it feels like women can throw hissy fits and tantrums and it's somewhat accepted. But the moment like a man raises his voice in frustration that his boundaries are being repeatedly violated, it's like, don't you intimidate me. Don't show me that. Like, it's so frightening. And I feel men
I hear
have
you.
been shamed and muted out of their anger. And personally, I think, of course, it can go too far, but it's somewhat liberating and freeing for men to actually reclaim this emotion as a very legitimate part of the emotional rainbow of expression. So I kind of feel like male anger is somewhat of a cause for me to, I want to demystify and non-pathologize. Like, hey, are
Well,
you angry? There's probably a good reason. Let's explore it. Now, if you were a therapeutic client of mine, it's unlikely that we're going to stay there. We're going to analyze it. We're going to find out what's going on. We're going to milk it for clues and inform you better. But the very starting salvo of just like, oh, male anger, no, that's not the right way, I find very, very unhelpful. And I do find that that message is perpetuated in society as a way of keeping men down, of making men shut up about the injustices and sufferings that they've been through. Like, we don't want to see your anger. Your male anger is scary. It's unacceptable. I'm like, well, if you're going to keep treating us like shit, what do you expect? Like at some point, we're going to get angry.
Uh, Alexander, I definitely do not disagree with you. I guess if I'm being honest, I just feel like that's not going to change. And so when,
Wait, what's not going to change? Like the mistreatment of men?
no, hopefully not. What I mean is that when a man expresses his anger, especially women tend to, whether it's authentic or not, they get intimidated and shut down. And I think that if we're going to have some solutions to men's sufferings and injustices, especially since so many of them, I think, seem to come in their relationships with women, we need them at the table. And whether it's justified or not, if a man gets angry and a woman leaves and refuses to continue the discussion, I don't see how that might be in the long-term best interests of both parties. So I agree with you in essence. I just found that it's not an effective communication tactic, as it were. And so I try to remove it as much as possible from my communication, not because I don't think the anger is bad or evil or unjustified, but just that it doesn't work.
I totally appreciate the nuance. I'd love to jump in. So you're taking a practical approach, like, yeah, you
Yeah.
might be justified, but if it's not going to lead to the desired outcome, what's the point? I totally get that. From my perspective, you're right, like 80% of the time, but I would still argue that 20% of the time, righteous, targeted anger about your own boundaries being violated is actually very effective. I can point to instances in my real life and in the instances of some of my closest male friends where while they were doing things nice, at some point the mistreatment became so egregious that there became a spontaneous expression of anger and outrage and disgust about what they are being subjected to. And seeing the strength and sincerity of that anger in that moment had the effect of piercing something in a woman's understanding, which previously she was closed off to, because it finally revealed the depth of the impact that this was having on him. And so, again, like I just don't think it's helpful, doctor, to take anger and to try and move it away as like a full part of your expression. You know, like I said, it's part of the rainbow. For most time, you're talking greens, blues, pinks, purples. That's fine. Occasionally, sometimes it's got to be red. That's more my perspective.
I hear you. I've experienced that myself in a relationship with the last time I lived with a woman, maybe 10 or 11 years ago. I tried so many different ways to get through to her about some of her behavior and how we could best get along in our relationship. And it was only when I sort of fucking lost my temper that she saw the depth of like the seriousness of the problem. And there is some truth to that. It's like if I got in front of a group of people and said, "Hey, the building's on fire. We all need to leave right now or we're going to die." It's like no one would really take that seriously because the emotional energy doesn't correspond with the importance of the message.
Yep.
And she did change for a while. But what I did learn is that it was sort of like training that woman to only respond to, on some level, anger. And I didn't want to have to get angry in order to be heard. So I felt like the better solution was actually to leave that relationship, which I did.
Yep.
But speaking of which, Alexander, I mean, we've talked a lot about in kind of more general terms about injustices or boundary violations that men are facing. What do you think that some of the biggest challenges facing men today? Like, what do you see in your hero circle or in your consultations that is catching your interest of late?
God, so much. There's a lot of struggle to find quality women. There's such a massive divide at the moment between the values of men and the values of women. You see it express itself politically, with men being more conservative, women being more progressive, but it's not even about that. It's about values. And so there's a much smaller pool of women available that men are finding attractive, and there's a lag. It seems to me like the cultural winds are shifting, values are shifting, but men are a lot more sensitive to that, whereas women have a lot of inertia for the past. And so there's going to be quite a big gap, it seems like, for a while between men having moved this way and they want like non-promiscuity, they want traditional values, they want gender roles, they want children, they want families, and women are making that same shift as well, is my read on the culture, but it's happening slower. And so there's a big gap at the moment between a bunch of men who want this and a bunch of women who want this. I'd also say that most people, men and women, are not actually psychologically well adjusted at the moment to make a relationship work because of the massive mental health crisis. I think that the latest iteration of parenting, so that people who are coming up now, 20s and 30s, was just done so badly that so few people are actually emotionally ready for the kind of maturity and sacrifices, compromises, and understanding that a relationship takes. And so when you do get into relationships, a lot of these people are just hurting each other. And I am a strong believer that the heart can only break so many times. If you have three, four dysfunctional relationships after another, at some point you lose the capacity to maintain hope and optimism and get it for the right thing. I would very much like to see, although it's not a small task, this generation of parents doing a much different job when it comes to parenting, so that when we deliver people into adulthood at 18, they don't have a long list of mental health issues that prevent them from getting into relationships, so that their first girlfriend, or at least their second or third, is the one that sticks. And then there's still good capacity for optimism, loyalty, pair bonding, stable families.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I see that as well. There's definitely been a shift towards, let's say, the center, or towards more traditional values in America. I can't speak to Australia. Certainly in male culture, I do see the females lagging behind. I wonder if at what point, having lived in a certain, let's say, progressive or more modern way, they even have the capacity to go back and be the types of women that men might find attractive and might be conducive to healthy, harmonious relationships. I wonder.
It's
Uh,
never been done before. Sorry to interrupt, but
no,
yeah,
go ahead.
it it's a huge experiment. We've never had, I don't think, a culture in the modern world that has gone more progressive and then come back to traditional values. So far, the wheel of history has only moved to break down traditions over and over and over and over and over
Mm,
again. That's what the
mm,
West has been doing for a while. Whether
mm.
we can backtrack is the grand experiment that we're in right now. And I know this will be a point of divergence, but you might be pleased to see that there's an increase in religiosity in the West. And I'm pleased about what that reflects, although I'm not religious myself. And it will be interesting to see what role that plays in the reestablishment of these values.
Yeah, that's well said. So it might have to come from the next generation, but uh, if they're looking to their own parents and the elders in their culture for guidance, it's almost like they have to spontaneously generate or go further back into the past, uh, maybe even centuries, to find some sort of guiding principle. Um, why don't you share with us? Because I can't speak from this. I don't live with a woman and I don't have children. So, uh, would you mind talking about how the normal dynamic between man and woman changes once you start living together, once you decide to have a family? Um, what happens in
It's
your
so
experience?
good. It's so good. It's really the peak of human experience. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it because I don't get to speak about it much on my channel. So, when you're an individual, there is a wide spectrum of things that you need to be thinking of and conscious of at any one time. When you become a couple, you gradually start to cede some of that territory to the other person. It doesn't happen in a codependent way if you're conscious about it. What happens is, that's their strength, this is my weakness, and so it naturally gets sorted to them. And so you do start to think of yourself less as a couple. And I honestly believe that this is neurological. I don't really consider my life to life experience at the moment very much as an individual. I think of it as a family. Like my brain has become somewhat of a hive mind of that family. What it's allowed me to do is specialize in the things that I'm good at, which has been wonderful for my self esteem and my efficacy. I can get 3 times as much done. I can do it 10 times better than I used to be able to do because I now focus almost exclusively on those masculine tasks, knowing with absolute confidence that my loving partner of 15 years has got all of the feminine stuff handled. And so you feel incredible about yourself and you can watch it happening. And there's a real reward, I think, that your brain dumps upon you when you successfully merge yourself as to be part of a group, part of a team. This is the appeal of cults, this is the appeal of religions. Sorry to offend if anybody does. This is the appeal of any kind of tribalistic movement. I don't think we really like feeling like individuals. I would argue that the best group to be a part of is a family unit because that's when you can feel your own individuality being subsumed by something that's even better than that. And it doesn't feel threatening. You feel like you can reestablish yourself at any time, but those muscles naturally atrophy as you strengthen other ones. And it would be devastating for my psyche were I to lose this relationship, because it would mean having to re-establish all of those things. And I'd have to drop in self-esteem because I'd have to be reliant upon doing things that are not my natural strength. And it's also just an absolute pleasure to watch. She's so women, I honestly believe that women do not actually come into their full expression of femininity while they're single. Certainly not while they're children. Femininity matures inside relationships, because in the same way that I've rediscovered my own masculinity by allowing her to handle all the feminine parts of life, for her to be able to give up all of the masculine parts of life has allowed her to blossom. And there's nothing better to just look at and contemplate. Just watching a woman being a woman, for me as a man, is intoxicating. It's beautiful. And so every single day, anytime I'm bored, I can just look at my partner doing her thing, and it thrills me to no end. It's extremely pleasurable.
This is very interesting because it runs counter to a lot of the commentary that you'll hear online, or even that I hear from some of my clients, which is typically as the relationship goes on, the sex falls away, the woman gains weight, they become kind of roommates. You're speaking in a way that it's you're.
Has anyone else got Dr. Orion frozen? Just nod if you do. Okay, just checking it's not on my end. He's frozen. Yeah, he's doing an Elsa impersonation. I'll take over if it's all right with you guys. I'll just read some of these chats that you guys have written. As Dr. Orion says, where understanding exists, anger does not. I'm 26, confirmed, read The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. I heard a joke from another Gen Z guy that anytime he met a Gen Z woman, he would try and get mental illness. Yeah, yeah. Tana says, this is so true. Not everyone's well suited to be in a relationship. Yeah. Dan says, if you go back far enough in history, it runs in cycles. Does it? The infinite line towards progressivism is itself a lie of progressivism. That's interesting. When Dan comes on, I'd love for him to expand upon that. I've been thinking about like ancient Rome. I know that they went further into progressivism, but then my thought, my understanding of history, which might be limited, is that what's led to their downfall. Like ultimately you go progressive, 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 and then eventually you just crash because there's nothing holding you. There might have been periods in the long history of the empire where they kind of came back to more conservative or traditional. I don't actually know. So if someone's more experienced in history, I'd love to get more information about that. What I'll do now is I might just open it up to Dan. I see you've got your hand up. Are you
Yeah,
able to
sorry about
unmute
that.
yourself?
I just
Oh, wait.
got booted off. I'm back. Thanks for handling my brief absence there, Alexander.
Yeah, no
Let's
worries.
let's open it up to the community, because they hear from me all the time and they want to get in front of you. And it sounds like you've already been communicating with Dan. So let's pin him. And anybody else who would like to ask Alexander a question, now's your time to queue up. Please raise your hand so that we can move through this in an orderly fashion. All right, Dan, you're up.
Testing 1, 2, 3. You hear me?
Yes, sir.
So comes from really early in the conversation, but I remember something that I really liked relating to sort of the red pill rage. It comes from Chris Williamson in the Modern Wisdom podcast, and what he said is, anger can be like a rocket booster, right? It gets you partway there. It has the power you need to get you lifted off the ground, but past a certain point, it starts weighing you down. That's what I found my experience to be. The other side of it was with respect to those cultural cycles of history. If you read Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin, he basically studied like 87 civilizations throughout the whole anthropological record of most of human history, and found that anytime a advanced civilization reduced its sexual restraints, the society eventually collapsed. I see my ground.
No worries. Yeah, that's my understanding of it as well.
Well, why do you think that is? Is it just as simple as the family being the bedrock of civilization, and once we kind of loosen those morals, we dig under what we can build upon?
Yeah, it's deeper even than the bedrock of civilization. It's the bedrock of biology. There's not a single biological organism that perpetuates itself without reproduction. It is the core of who we are. At the very essence of who you are as a being, everybody listening, is that desire for reproduction. If you don't place that as one of the highest values of culture, you're fundamentally at odds with the reality. And of course, evolution, you will die out. Why would you not die out? Society is only going to replicate societies that place that as the top priority.
Okay, thank you. Richard, you're up.
Yeah, it's interesting. The topic went to anger. It's a subject I've been thinking myself about, my own anger management, my own anger that I have. My ex-girlfriend said something interesting when I would talk about things that bothered me. She said, "I wish you would get angry at me," kind of relating to your story, Orion, where I would just relate it pretty calmly and pretty rationally. And it was really interesting because on the one hand, I really thought maybe I should have, it kind of relates to your story, Orion. It's like, maybe it's an effective way to communicate how serious the issue is. And maybe it would have been more effective to communicate how significant the issues were. But part of me was really conflicted on it because I also felt like it was kind of satisfying for her and maybe other women to provoke that kind of reaction from a man, to kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, make him lose his cool, and perhaps he would be in a more emotionally vulnerable state than a state that might be easier to manipulate, for lack of a better way of putting it. So it was something even now I'm really torn about, whether what she said was something I should have done or whether I was sort of right to be a little bit more calm about it.
Yeah, I think nice to meet you, Richard. I can understand this difficulty. And I can also understand that this is probably what has motivated Dr. Orion's advice about anger. My perspective is that there's such a massive difference between targeted, methodical, righteous anger and reactive, emotional, hysterical anger. And to lump the two of them in together is a really, really bad idea. You're doing it a disservice. I actually think it's extremely attractive for women to see a man in righteous anger, because it reassures her that he is going to be able to come to her defense when her boundaries are violated. Like, look at my man go. Look at the strength. Look at the passion. Look at the moral clarity with which he can speak. He's also going to be able to stand up for children. If she is consistently disrespecting your boundaries and you do not get angry, then how are you going to be able to stand up for her when her boundaries are being violated by some third party? So my partner is aware of my anger. It does not get triggered very often because I'm 37. I've largely sorted out my life so that I don't get exposed to things that are terrible. But she's certainly seen me in public, like, tell people off, lecture them, get on top of it. There's a full masculine potency that comes from that. What she doesn't see is me whining like a bitch, right? Because that's not where I'm coming from. What you need to do is make sure that you have non-anger based boundaries and methods for reinforcing those boundaries in place that you do over a long period of time leading up to it. It should be sort of the fifth kind of, if this happens and happens and happens and happens, you should be able to say, I have already told you this time I made this clear, so that there's a real strength behind it, so she can see, oh shit, I really did ignore it. If the very first time you ever object to her violating your boundaries is anger, she's right to view you as weak and feminine, because it's like, dude, where did this come from? You're just waiting till now? Can you only speak to me when you're fueled by anger? That's bullshit. That's not good. So it's a complex and nuanced topic, but I would encourage you, Richard, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Anger is much maligned in our society, particularly from men. I think it has very valuable lessons to be learned about psychology, and also, frankly, in generating attraction from women. I think they like it when it's done right.
I think that was really helpful for me personally. I think that might have, maybe you spoke about that on your channel and I just missed that episode. And I do agree with Richard that reactive anger, as you put it, it feels like being the bull who gets manipulated by the bullfighter to charge wherever the cape is presented. And it generally doesn't end well for the bull, right? But if you're drawing a line between that kind of triggered reactive anger and a considered forceful response to injustice or violation, I think we can definitely agree on on that ground. I think that's well said. Do you feel like the boundary violations of women do they tend to be conscious in your opinion, or is this something that women seem to, we talk about on the internet as shit tests, right? To what extent do you feel that women know what they're doing, or is it just sort of like an evolutionarily programmed way to test men and their masculinity?
No, the quick answer is most people are doing everything unconsciously. The level of self-awareness from the average human is embarrassingly low. It certainly needs to be improved. But where I would say the nuance of this, Doctor, is that the society is set up at the moment so that the violation of men's boundaries is considered acceptable. It's considered normal. That's the struggle that we find ourselves in, because it is acceptable to treat men in really horrific, dehumanizing ways. That's the culture that we've set up, the demonization of masculinity. The truth is, though, is that even though it's normal and it's been done for a number of decades now, it's still outrageous. And so it takes the violation of those boundaries and seeing a man righteously defend himself in order to wake up a woman, not just to the point that unconsciously she was violating his boundaries, but unconsciously she was acting within societal norms. And it takes a big shock, I think, for a woman to go like, what the fuck are these norms that I've been operating under? I would never let a man speak to me the way that I've been speaking to these men. And suddenly he's presenting himself as a human in front of me, and I'm getting this woke up by call, like, oh shit, what was I thinking? What am I doing?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it even goes a step further. Like, I saw some headlines a while back about Australia appointing some sort of minister on male behavior. Was that just a publicity stunt, or did that go through? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know. That doesn't surprise me.
Oh, yeah. I think it was some sort of federal post that was supposed to be kind of a bellwether for the way that men were kind of behaving in society. And it was a woman that was certainly appointed to that position. I don't know if it actually went through. I think it did. And the grounds were like women and the government giving feedback on how men could do better. So it wasn't just so much, let's say, boundary violations or disrespect, but there is this sort of like in the West, this cultural understanding that women are allowed to tell men how they're failing and how they can man up and how they can do better. But that's generally not reciprocated. Do you want to talk to that?
No, because you did it perfectly. It's outrageous. I don't have anything additional to say about that, but it's fucking ridiculous. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's okay when it's coming in one direction. It's not okay coming in the other direction. And so what I would say, and the reason why you're seeing so much anger from me at the moment, is the default right now, our default cultural assumptions in our treatment of men, to me, are a gross boundary violation. And that's why I do get angry, is because the way that men are treated right now, in my mind, is unacceptable. It has to change. It's not okay.
I hear you. And I see your hand, Catherine. I'll get to you in a second. And just so that we don't make it, women over here and men over here, maybe you've seen this on your own channel, Alexander, but I feel like on Psych-Hacks, I tend to give both sexes a good talking to from time to time. And I certainly am harsher, in my opinion, to men. In several episodes, I'll say that the vast majority of them are unattractive, that people will step over them on the street if they fail. Nobody really cares about their sufferings. Most of them are unremarkable. You have to work very hard to cultivate excellence, et cetera, et cetera. But if I have even a smallest constructive, in my opinion, criticism of women, and a criticism aligned with what I perceive to be their goals, which are generally to have long-term, stable relationships with men, I get all kinds of negative responses, but not just from women, also from men. And I wonder if you'd speak to that, because I've never had one of those episodes where I give men a talking to, where a woman will send me an email privately and say, Orion, do you hate men? Like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you go? Don't men suffer enough? Why are you misandrous in this way? But they'll isolate it and talk, and it's not just women. Like, men will come to their defense as well. What do you think is that really what we're coming up against? It's not just like a man or woman thing. It's a cultural interject that actually a lot of men also carry along with them.
So your diagnosis is correct. There are a lot of like men's failings. What I would say is that it's more reflective of your unique audience because my experience is different. If I stop criticizing women or I start criticizing men too much, that's when I get a huge amount of pushback from my audience. So
No
there's a bit of
kidding.
audience capture there, I think. So
Wow.
there are many things that I would criticize men for that I don't give voice to on my channel because it receives such a negative reaction. I guess over the years, because that hasn't been the focus of my channel, men come there for reprieve. They're sick of being told where they're
Mm,
failing and things like
mm,
that. They want to see somebody hold women to account, and that's kind of, I guess, become somewhat my role. I don't love that. But I do get a very negative reaction. So it sounds like you get a negative reaction the other way. So your channel would be serving a different emotional purpose for your audience, would be my guess. So you'd be more moderate, more measured than probably I am on my channel, which is perfectly fine. I'm jealous. I wish I could be a bit more like that. It doesn't seem to be that the way that the algorithm has pushed me. I'm in too deep now, but I'm not sure I can comment on a deeper kind of trends. I think it just depends on who you're speaking to there as
Well,
to
that's
what reaction you
interesting.
get.
And just so we all understand, I think last time I checked, about 80 to 85% of my audience was male. Do you know the figures on your own channel, Alexander?
I'm 96% men.
Okay, so that does make sense. Okay, Catherine, let's hear from you, please.
Hello, hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a psychotherapist from Canada, and I've worked with men for 4 years in treatment centers. So I very appreciate all the content. It's so interesting. There's definitely a societal problem right now, and to me, it's just fascinating how abuse coming from women that unconscious or not to trigger men and their anger, and then it's like they trigger them, but then when they get angry is so inappropriate, is wild to me. It's wild. And I'm to me, it's also, how the court system is really not equal just yet, and how, when it comes to family law, for example, and how, um, yeah, it's just there's something that really needs to change. And coming back to the anger, because this is where I raised my hand, I think feminism is, in my opinion, destroying for a while the society, and how the relationships are right now. So I'm just trying to understand, this whole, yeah, unconscious or not, how when men are suddenly angry, which is more of an instinct for men, how to be vulnerable and express their emotions, how it's so unacceptable. So yeah.
So
All that's well said. Oh, go ahead, Alexander, if you have something.
It's wonderful that your audience includes women. Nice to meet you, Catherine. I wish I could get more women watching my channel. So there's two things that I'd like to say about that. Is that the hypocrisy of women of modern women, or modern feminism, I should say, is on full display when it comes to rejection of male anger. Because on the one hand, you do get the message, we'd like men to open up, we'd like to hear the emotions a lot more. Well, it turns out that the primary emotion a lot of men are feeling is anger, but women don't want to hear that. And so you have to ask the very uncomfortable question: when women say, I want him to open up more, what exactly does she want? And I don't have the answer to this yet, because if it's a true accounting of where he's at emotionally, you'd see a lot more women willing to listen to that anger. So when she wants him to be open up and to communicate, what specifically does she want? Does she want more data? Does she want to be able to connect? It doesn't seem like she wants to see or experience the emotional impact of her behavior onto him. And I find that very suspicious. And what I've seen consistently through my private consultations, I don't know if you've had this same experience, doctor, but a lot of men are reluctant to share their emotions with women, specifically because of the negative reaction that they have received from women when they tried to open up. It's like, okay, I want you to share, I want you to open up. Okay, so I cried in front of her and then she lost attraction to me. Or I got angry about something that she did and now suddenly she won't talk to me. She's keeping at a distance. So there needs to be a cultural conversation in my mind where women need to have an honest accounting about themselves, about why they're actually uncomfortable about male emotions. Because I feel like men are trying and women are failing at being that receptive partner on the whole. Men need to continue to try. I'm not letting them off the hook, but that's one thing. The other thing I'll say about anger that I always find very interesting is that if a woman does violate a man's boundaries and he gets angry, then suddenly that's what the conversation becomes about. Like, oh, well, now we need to talk about your anger. And that's a deflection tactic. I find it very frustrating. It's not that I don't have sympathy for how scary it might be for a woman to see a man in anger, but I'm also at the point of thinking, aren't we just a little bit sick of everything always happening on a woman's timeline? Like, what if his anger is asserting that this is the time that I want to talk about it and this is the manner that I want to talk about it? Why does everything always move at the pace of a woman's comfort? You know, to the point where it's like, oh, well, you're uncomfortable with my emotional expression. Okay, we'll talk about that. That's where we're going to go. What about the original boundary violation? It seems like men are expected to put aside their needs the moment that it makes a woman uncomfortable and then fit in with her timeline. And I'm finding that's really, really bothersome. And I'd like to get into it more if I ever get into like couples work to actually watch that dynamic play out in real time, because at the moment, I'm getting mostly secondhand evidence from people describing their relationship and their arguments to me. I'd actually like to see it happen in real time, but it's something that frustrates me that it doesn't seem to be that a man has the capacity to say, I'm sorry that you're uncomfortable, but we're going to keep having this conversation because it's what I want to do. Because it seems to be that the opposite is always socially acceptable for a woman to say, okay, well, you're uncomfortable. That's your job to be uncomfortable, man. You have to make things easy for me. And maybe that's how it has to be biologically, you know, 90% of the time, but sometimes it's got to be shared. A man's got to be able to dictate the terms of a relationship and a woman needs to tolerate her own discomfort. That's kind of where I've landed on that one.
You have a response to that, Catherine?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The timeline has to be on the woman's side. I think there's also a part where, because it's unconscious, there are some women that are traumatized, and so it makes it even more difficult to be able to hear from that and just be able to understand that anger is just a secondary emotion, and that as the anger iceberg, there's so many other things around, which makes it very vulnerable, right? Like, but yeah, the timeline, yeah, it's like it has to be on our timeline, or it's like, no, we're not talking about this right now. It's pretty unfair.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thanks, Catherine. Alexander, one of your recent episodes that I really resonated with, I think you were dismantling the myth that women are just more emotionally, what's the, do you know the language that you used? Like emotionally intelligent? Empathetic.
Yeah. He's going off his cell phone. Sorry, you dropped out after you said empathetic. Please continue, Doctor.
Oh, sorry. So that you had some really great about male altruistic behavior versus female altruistic behavior, and that a lot of that belief about female superior empathy is really big.
That's brutal. That's brutal. Doctor, if you're uploading your YouTube videos in the background, it's slowing down your bandwidth. So I apologize, everybody. Mike, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I think so. I'm curious to understand and this totally plays out in some recent experience. You know, the raising the issue of the boundary violation became my reaction, not the actual event.
Right.
I glossing over. Just can you talk? Like, there seems to be this inherent lack of accountability, and you know, my own experience of trying to drive some accountability and say, listen, like, what, you know, we have not gotten to the bottom of this. I want to understand where this perspective is and what this is all about. This is not okay. And eventually collapse the relationship. But can you talk a little bit about just the inherent perspective, like women's accountability and how to drive that accountability into a relationship, maybe some tactical, practical advice.
Yeah. So what's happening there, Mike, is it is a deflection tactic, and she's allowing she's successfully able to derail the conversation so that she doesn't have to take accountability. Alyssa has asked if this is still being recorded. I don't know. I'm so sorry. What I would say is that. Sorry, Doctor. I'm just answering a question from Mike, and then I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks for carrying on. I'm sorry for the connectivity issues.
No worries. You were just asking Mike about
The accountability.
allowing yourself to get deflected. Yeah. So what I would say, rather than any practical tips, is that there's got to be a mindset shift inside you, Mike, in terms of your own understanding of what's going on, because then everything should flow naturally. Because I don't want you to not shift your values or your understanding and then artificially just start saying things a little bit different. What I want to reassure you is that what you suspect is happening in that moment of you getting deflected and distracted so she can avoid accountability, 100% is happening. Okay, know that inside yourself. Also know that you have every right to resolve your issue first before you get to hers, and that's not being cruel. Also know that you have every right to be comfortable and to have your boundaries respected as much as she does. What I've witnessed is a lot of men buy into the frame that she needs to be placated, she needs to be understood, you need to be very soft, very gentle, all of that. And then in so doing, they become codependent in her distraction tactic of avoiding accountability. So what it would look like if you knew this from an absolute certain rock solid place is that when she does that deflection tactic, you say, okay, that's a legitimate question, we will address that. But right now we're talking about what you did this. We will finish that first and then we will get to this. And if she said, no, we need to talk about this, and just say, why? This is what we started with. I'm still upset. I understand that you're upset. I was upset first. We learned this in primary school, in grade school. We take turns, so we get in line, fucking figure it out, So what I would say is that you've probably had an entire lifetime, Mike, of anti-male propaganda inside you that tells you to put your needs second, to put a woman's first. This is what I'm trying to upend inside your mind, is a revolution, psychologically speaking, of your own self-esteem, so that when you find yourself in that situation again, you don't have rules for thee, but not for me. You see, no. Were this happening the opposite things, this is how we would address these things. I'm not dismissing what you're saying. I don't not care, but my needs are also important. We've already started this. We will resolve this, and then we will move on to you. And guess what? I know it sounds strange, it sounds counterintuitive, but as much as she might kick and scream, she will thank you for it, because that actually shows male leadership. You're not just rocked side to side by whatever fucking emotion she's got at the moment. You're like, no, I have a clear understanding of what we're doing. I'm showing direction. We are resolving this right now, and she'll be attracted to that masculinity. It's really win-win. It does take practice to get it right, but it's a worthwhile skill to build, absolutely. Does that answer your question, Mike?
Oh yeah, 100%. Slightly nuanced there, because we've been having a chat ongoing with a couple of members here. It's this sort of, where's the line between showing vulnerability and then being disrespected because of it? Right? Is that a perceived? It turns out to be a perceived weakness, and then you end up, you end up giving the hammer to your partner and then complaining that you're being hit over the head.
Right. So this will be an interesting thing. I'd like to stick with this, because previously when I spoke to Dr. Ryan a couple of years ago, this was a point of disagreement with us. I wonder if I've shifted or if he's shifted. So pay attention to my answer here, Ryan, and see if you answer it. But from my perspective, I think that men can be more vulnerable than they're currently being. And I understand that they get punished from women. From my perspective, what matters is not the vulnerability. It's the frame with which it's happening under. So if you're vulnerable in front of a woman and you receive negative feedback from that, then that becomes an issue. Because when she's talking about strength, what kind of masculine strength is she actually referring to or craving? Does she want repression? Does she want a robot? Does she want somebody who never makes mistakes or failures? Or does she want somebody who feels, who fails, who picks themselves back up again and keeps trying? And if she doesn't understand that that's part of the regular human experience, and as a man, you're going to trip over and fail, then the work is on her to adjust her expectations to reality. I think that too many men get caught up in this image of like the traditional stoic, heroic kind of man, and they feel a pressure to live up to that. I don't feel that way. I fuck up constantly, and I'm absolutely fine with failing because I know it doesn't matter if I make a mistake. What matters is what I do in the aftermath. And if my partner ever shamed me for making a mistake, that would become an issue for me. That's a boundary violation. I say, no, I absolutely am entitled to be able to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, and I still expect your support. If I don't get that, then that's a you problem, and you need to work on that. And I demand that. That's a minimum standard for me.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the anger that we were talking about earlier, in the sense that I agree with you, Alexander. I don't think it's often effective in practice. Just like we were talking about a moment ago with respect to what were we talking about? Oh, when you were saying that women often complain that they want their men to open up, but when they start to show anger, when they start to tear up, then that is often weaponized against them, or they lose attraction. And so what do they really want? In my personal experience, to answer that question, when a woman asks her boyfriend or her husband or her man to be more emotionally available, I think that she wants a very small spectrum of his emotion. And I think that she's actually seeking reassurance in that moment of his feelings for her. So the only kind of acceptable emotion that she wants to receive is love and reassurance from the man about how he feels about her in that moment. And anything that falls out, but men hear, of course, the words that she's saying. It's like, oh, she wants me to be more open with my emotions. That's great, because I've been holding all this shit in. I would love to be able to share and to have a safe place to communicate and to bring that to. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And I think this is just like a translation issue, kind of between men and women. Men are listening to the words that women say, but women aren't. I don't think they really want that kind of full spectrum of emotion.
Okay, I really want to jump in here, because this is a very interesting divergence of opinion, I think, between the two of us, of which I'd love to explore with you, Doctor. So from my perspective, and you just tell me where I'm getting this wrong, but to me, you're playing into women's hands and you're not being greedy enough. I think you can be more ambitious, because what I'm hearing from you is that when a woman is like, practically, I can't really deal with hearing of your emotions. And then it seems like the advice that you offer there is, men, practically speaking, even though you're in the right, it's not going to work out, so don't do it. Whereas for me, I hold women to a higher standard than that. I want to hold them accountable. I say, yeah, I understand practically this isn't actually that effective to you. Sucks to be you. Toughen up. I'm a high quality guy. You want to be with me? Fucking get your act together. You need to be more supportive. You need to show more empathy. So the fact that women aren't good at this, to me, is not a reason to retreat from the battle. It's to raise your standards and to demand more from women.
I think you can certainly make that argument. To me, it's like, don't bring your grocery list to the hardware store. So men have these emotional needs. They want to share. They want to communicate what their inner experience is, and to not be judged and I don't know, have that used against them. But I found, just between you and me and everyone else that's listening, I've just found that to be so much more easy and enjoyable and successful when I bring that to understanding men. And I've realized that there are some women who do have the emotional maturity and understanding to be able to hold the full spectrum of emotionality that men experience, but that a lot of them don't. And so I just have sort of, that's just how they are. And to expect that they're going to be more or different is, I don't know, a futile task. But I can understand your perspective.
What do you do with the data set that I offer you? Because in your personal life, Doctor, that's your experience, and you're extrapolating from that and then making a generalization about women as them being incapable of that. But I offer you anecdotal evidence of my girlfriend, my mother, my therapist, my 2 co-counseling partners, all of them women, all capable of being present for me in my emotions, that I've specifically chosen and cultivated that capacity inside them. And they do a wonderful job. Men are not my primary emotional support network, but this list of women, they do wonderful for me because I've demanded it. So how do you think that this is just a weird outlier? Or do you think there's something unique about me? Or is it possible that you're selling women short?
It is possible, but I do admit that I have met and had relationships with women who could do that. But my personal experience, and it could be, biased by the law of small numbers, is that most women don't. And I'd rather, just like, it's sort of like, I like baseball, but not all of my guy friends like baseball. So I don't need to, educate them on the sport and why it's a really impressive or a beautiful game, and to bring them along when I get tickets. I'll just find somebody who likes to go to the game. And, rather than demand a higher standard of women that seem to fail in this regard, I just move on.
So I mean, I feel very passionately about this. I mean, I love and respect you, Doctor, so there's nothing personal. But in my mind, I couldn't be more strongly opposed to the perspective that you're taking, because from my perspective, you basically saying that women are incapable directly plays into their hands to allow them to continue to show a lack of empathy for men. Do you see that? Like, by having such low expectations of them, you are enabling them to continue to ignore men's suffering and pain. No, they're adults. They're humans. They can fucking step up to the task. Men are suffering. Sucks to hear about it. I'm sorry about your little feminine emotions. But guess what? This is what we've been doing for millennia. Now's finally the time for you to actually grow up and mature. And right now, it seems like you're making excuses for them to not have to do that.
Well, again, I'm not arguing that women are incapable. I've said multiple times that I've met and had relationships with women who can do this, but that I don't think that most women do. I can see your point, but I've also, I think, tried to hold some of these women to a higher standard in the past, and I don't feel like it was successful, in the sense that I don't think they rose to that, let's say, challenge. I think that if people change, men or women, it's because they experience sufficient pain in their models of reality to finally examine what they believe to be true and to potentially make some changes. And maybe losing a relationship with me is part of that change, part of the pain that they might experience to examine their beliefs. Maybe not. When I was younger, I'm sure that many women thought that losing a relationship with me was no great loss. But I feel that people are going to experience pain when they come into contact with reality in the wider world, as opposed to just running fictitiously against my own expectations for them. That's just been my personal experience.
From my perspective, we can leave this here, but if you're dating a woman who is growth oriented, this really shouldn't be that difficult a task. If you can essentially express to her that her growing and her capacity to show empathy is part of her becoming a more well-rounded, well-developed person, any woman who wants to be the best version of herself will get on board with that if you can do a successful job masculine leading. And so with all due respect, it just sounds like you weren't dating quality enough women. You just needed higher standards.
No, I think you're certainly. I mean, like many men, when I was in my 20s, I just went after what I was most attracted to.
Sure.
And I figured out what their personalities and their inner life was like further down the line, right? So I think you're absolutely, we can agree on that. I think I have an episode about you can't have any relationship with anyone. And so if you do want to have a high ethical relationship, if you want to have a deep emotional connection, it does make sense to choose women who are capable of doing that or who are growth oriented. And expecting that a woman who isn't growth oriented to suddenly want to change to be better aligned with what you think might be best for her, I think is a recipe for futility. Can we agree on that?
Yes, 100%.
Right.
And I know that Connor and Austin want to speak, but if there are any women, like you seem to have quite a few women in part of your audience, that's awesome. I don't know how they're feeling sitting there, like having us talk about their capacity for emotion.
I've invited them. A lot of them like to show up in the chat, but I've explicitly invited them to be more active. And so if there are more women in this conversation, get out of the chat, raise your hand, and let's actually have a discussion. But in the meantime, let's attend to the men who have raised their hands. Connor, you're up.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question kind of came up earlier when you were talking about trauma, and it was kind of in the modern world and the way, I don't know, the modern feminist world is, a lot of women hide behind trauma as like a reason that, I don't know, they want to disregard men or they don't want to listen or whatever. So what do you think the appropriate way to like hold space for trauma is? Like, okay, something really horrible did happen to you, like have empathy for you, but I'm not going to let that be a reason that you can be shitty to me, you know?
Oh man, the weaponization of trauma as an excuse for traumatizing another person is such bullshit. Thank you for asking this very important question, Connor. If somebody has been traumatized, the correct response from you is sympathy for their emotions. It's not you relaxing your boundaries around them. That doesn't make any fucking sense whatsoever. So if somebody's trying that, you should call them out on their bullshit. It's like, hey, you're traumatized. Guess what? I'm willing to sit with you for 2-3 hours and hold you as you're crying. I'm here to talk to you, journal with you, take you to specialists to work through all of that. Like, I'm 100% on your team, ready to sympathize with your trauma. But the fact that you're traumatizing doesn't mean you get to disrespect my boundaries or treat me badly. Like, that's bullshit. That's not the appropriate way to deal with trauma. So if anybody's trying that sleight of hand, they are delegitimizing their own trauma and using it as a cheap way to avoid accountability. Really low quality behavior. I would have stern words with any woman who tried that shit.
Yeah, I talk about this issue in the episode, The Trap of Understanding, is that sometimes this is a kind of a bid for relaxed boundaries or extra resources, more consideration, more patience, more understanding. It's usually unidirectional, it's not reciprocated. Because they've been hurt in the past, some people feel entitled to more and better treatment from others than they would otherwise deserve. And the metaphor I use is like, basically, not everybody is ready to have a relationship, which I think you said earlier in this conversation, right, Alexander? That most people, men and women, are just not emotionally mature enough to undergo the bonding process, as it were, which I would agree with. And it's like if you broke your leg, no one would think that you were ready to start on the first string of the football team. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it doesn't mean that you're out of the game for good, but maybe you need to take some time on the sidelines and heal that leg until you can actually not be a liability for your team. And nobody thinks that you deserve to play, even though you really want to, because you're not going to be able to make effective action on the field. So I think that I think that was very well said. You can have sympathy and empathy for the pain and the emotional experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to relax your standards with respect to who gets to be on the field.
Yeah, if you wouldn't do it to somebody, Connor, then why would you allow somebody else to do it to you? If you know you've been through some shit, if you would hold yourself to the standard, I'm not going to make that somebody else's problem, then there's no reason to not hold that for the woman in your life.
Well said. Thank you for your question, Connor.
Thank you, guys.
Austin, you're up.
Hi there. Can you see me? It doesn't matter, but 1 second. Okay.
There you
Sorry. I thought this meeting was at a different time. My apologies for being late. So one thing I was wondering, Alexander, regarding vulnerability is I remember I watched the talk that you and Orion had about this, and the position I'm in is I want you to be right, but I feel like Orion is correct. And the only reason I say that is because, I mean, just from my own experience, anytime that I have cried or shown emotion, you know, like it just, I do feel like the women that I've been dating have lost attraction for me. But to your point, I also think those women were very low quality people in general. They had a lot of personal issues and a lot of trauma that I, you know, made excuses for because I fell into the trap of understanding, as Orion talked about. But I will say that with this current relationship I've been in, I've tried the approach of, you know, not only do I not show like me crying, I don't even display any negative emotion around her, which that is a challenge, especially because I'm a very, oh man, that's not a good
got a
reaction.
reaction from Alexander on that one.
I'm so upset to hear that. Oh my God, Austin. Please continue.
The only reason I haven't is because doing so has honestly netted pretty good results, but you know, at the same time, you know, it doesn't feel terribly authentic. um and
Well, that's gonna be an understatement. Shit.
right, but I don't know, like it's just what is the balance, I guess, because you know, like like I said, I am a very emotional person. I'm a very sensitive person too, and you know, like I've tried to, you know, become a little bit less sensitive, but I don't know. I'm very interested to hear your response just based on your reactions.
I mean, what I hear you say, Austin, is that because it's more comfortable for the woman and she seems happier, you are willing to twist and contort yourself and go through the charade of pretending like you don't have any of these negative emotions, which directly plays into her comfort at your expense because you're a sensitive soul. I could not more strongly disagree with the approach that you're taking. I think it's fucked up, and I really hope that you're not looking at materials that reinforce this idea. I'm sorry that you had experiences in the past where you were open up and you were vulnerable with women and it went badly. But dare I say, two factors involved. One, low quality women, which you already acknowledged. Or two, maybe you did a bad job of holding her to account afterwards. It does take skill, but if you can develop some righteous anger around your own right to fail, to make mistakes, to have emotions, when a woman does fail in the first instance, you should be able to speak to her. Hey, the way that you responded to me in that situation, that wasn't good enough. I need better from my partner. And then once she's woken up, you can go softer. Like, hey, don't you want to understand me? Don't you want to connect with me? Don't you want to know me? Don't you want to sense a part of resiliency in me that doesn't involve me twisting and contorting and censoring myself and repressing my emotions, but trusting that whatever comes up, we're going to be safe. We're going to be strong and solid enough to be able to work through it. Don't you want that kind of a relationship? And if she doesn't, then what are you doing with her? So no, I hate everything that you just said, and I hate the way that you're approaching your own relationship. If you're a sensitive soul, at some point you're probably going to burst, and this is exactly why women have the negative nice guy perception. You know, like nice guys are maligned on the internet. It's because guys, they repress their negative emotions on and on and on, trying to be the nice guy, always make sure she's there, and at some point it bursts, and you'll just yell at her and scream at her for something that was probably quite minor because you've repressed things for so long, and then she'll be like, you were faking the entire time, and then she'll go online and complain on all the feminist forums about how you're a fake nice guy and all of that bullshit. You have anger, you have sadness, you have fear. Learn how to deal with it maturely inside your relationship. Integrate it, talk to her about it, and if she fails, if she falls short of being the supportive, loving partner that she should be, call her out on it. Demand more. That's my advice. I'm very triggered by what you said. Sorry.
Yeah. So I just want to add something. So it's not that I didn't convey that very well. It's not that I never display, any negative emotion whatsoever. It's just that, if she does something that, that bothered me, I approach it in a very stoic way. Like, for example, she was like, 20 minutes late one time, and that's a waste of my time. I told you to be here at 1:30, you're here at 1:50. So I just told her, hey, I'm pretty sure I said 1:30, and she was just like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." And I was like, I didn't tell her it was okay, but I just I teased her about it. I didn't overreact, I should say. I'm making sure that I'm not being reactive with my emotions, I should say. It's not that I don't display any negative emotion whatsoever. It's just I'm very controlled about it. And the thing about displaying my emotions before is it's hard to even call these women out on it because they never directly say that me displaying my emotions made them lose attraction to me or whatever. In the moment, they're actually incredibly supportive, and they ostensibly want me to be more emotional, but I couldn't help but notice that the after effect of it was them losing attraction. But it's not in any way that I can call them out on it because they're it's very subtle. It's very, sometimes I'll even think that I'm going crazy thinking that that's what it was. But part of me just can't help but wonder if that's what it was. Like, for example, I used to be very comfortable just, always displaying my emotions. And, I used to go for women who, claimed that they wanted that in men. And in the beginning, when I first do that, they're like, oh my God, you're so different from any other guy that I've dated. You're so open with your emotions and all that. And I can't help but feel like even though they say that they really love it, part of them subconsciously doesn't like it. So I'm sorry that the way that I explained that was very upsetting, but I also appreciate how passionately you wanted me to do better for myself. So thank you.
God, you the very high quality community here, Dr. Ryan. These are spectacular guys. Austin, you were exceptionally articulate in explaining the exact nuance of where you were struggling there, and it's really helped me. So let me continue on from what I'm saying. So where you don't want to be reactive, like she's like 30 minutes late or 20 minutes late, whatever it was, the difference between like you just being like throwing a hissy fit as opposed to just teasing her is that there's got to be a calm and measured exploration of why that bothered you, right? So like, hey, it's okay, you tease her a little bit. Then 10 minutes into it, it's like, hey, can I actually talk to you about something? Not to place the blame on you, we're past that, but I noticed that when you were late, I had feelings of like insecurity come up. Like I was feeling maybe like disrespected or something like that. I realized that that's an important value for me. And then she'd be like, oh, why? Tell me more about that. I think this thing happened to me when I was a kid, or these are the values I was raised under. When that happened, I had thoughts like this. I think these thoughts are irrational, but I do think those thoughts that I was having, they might be worth exploring. And then you talk about it. When you said like in the moment that she's supportive of your emotions, but then afterwards she loses attraction, the same's got to happen in reverse, is that she does need time and space, encouraged by you, to explore what her reaction is to your emotional reaction. If she has to repress that, then it's going to fester and it's going to become negative. But you should understand that every time you're vulnerable in front of a woman, she's potentially going to have her own reaction to that, and you need to then make space for that. So the solution here is not less talking and less sharing, it's more talking and more sharing. So you cry in front of her, she's supportive, and then you feel better. And then afterwards, she's like, I gotta say, after that, I'm feeling a little bit scared. Like I'm relying on you to be my masculine rock and my leader, but seeing you break down, that's kind of freaked me out. Okay, that's a normal reaction. Now let's talk about that. And she's like, oh, I guess I had in my mind that you're Superman, you never make mistakes. Oh, okay, well, what if we had a different version of masculinity? Someone who does make mistakes, who does fall down, but always gets back up again. That's a new kind of strength that you can rely on. Oh shit, I never thought about that. Okay, I'm gonna start realigning my values to be attracted to that. And then you say to her, hey, when you said that I was failing as a man, that brought up this for me. Let's talk about that. Fucking talk. At some point, the problem is that you stop talking and then you go into silence and then you start to lose attraction. If you keep the dialogue going, to keep exploring each new swing of the pendulum, eventually you're going to find that you're able to talk about anything and it's going to feel very, very safe. I don't fundamentally believe that relationships can work based on a lack of transparency about what's going on inside either of your mind. You need to talk about it, and you need to talk about it in a masculine way and be the leader.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And I love your content. Thank you so much.
Good question. Awesome. Everybody, Alexander has a hard stop on the hour. He's been very generous with his time, so we want to respect his as well. All this boundary talk, I certainly don't want to violate his. So if you do have questions, raise your hand. It's now or never. John, you're up.
Right, Ryan, thank you so much. Alexander, thanks for joining. So fantastic discussion all around. Connor's question particularly caught my ear. I think mine's a different take on his, but if it's the same, feel free to pump me and send to the next person. So my question is this notion around using trauma or past experiences as an excuse for X. And I think Connor's question was more basically treating us like shit. But what about wholesale behavior on their end that might not relate directly to us? Like, let's say there's a behavior that I take issue with a partner of mine, and then she says, oh, well, that's because I was traumatized, and then just wholesale leaves it at that, and then expecting an excuse and, oh, you're traumatized, and thinking that that's like a wholesale out here without any accountability.
Yeah.
Alex, if you think that's the same question as Connor, just let me know. I want to let other people the chance to speak and not cover the same ground, but curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's a slightly different nuance. I can answer it quickly. Is that people need to understand that trauma is treated in a very specific way, and that's it. Like, it exists there. If you're traumatized, okay, you grieve about it, you talk about it, you integrate it. All of those behaviors are acceptable. All the other stuff outside of it, that's an unacceptable expression of trauma. Doesn't mean that she's not correct, that it's her trauma making her do this, but that doesn't also mean that she can't exert self-control. What's going to happen is essentially, like, let's say she's been traumatized, and so she desires to like make a big scene in public. For some reason that makes her feel better. Essentially, you need to say, I understand that doing that gives you a sense of relief, and not doing that is going to make you feel bad. Don't do it, feel bad, and then I'll comfort you through the feeling bad. That's the way to go about it.
Gotcha. So maybe one thing on there is, and I don't know if it's a dichotomy between male trauma and female trauma and how society reacts to it, but I've seen cases of like a woman saying, "Oh, I was in an abusive relationship," or something of that effect before, to explain a behavior of hers. And I think a lot of people just throw their hands up and say, "Oh," and play the sympathy cards about taking that extra step, being okay. Well, that's traumatic, but I think there's more underlying the surface here, and personal, depending on what it is, personal accountability has to kick in at a certain point.
Yeah, honestly, it's oil and water, John. So for everybody listening, there's no mix between trauma and a lack of accountability. The two exist there, completely different spheres. I really want this to solidify in your brain. If you're traumatized, then you're entitled to support, emotional, encouragement, grieving, all of that stuff. You're not entitled to then start violating other boundaries. That doesn't make any sense. There's a clear line between the two of them. Being traumatized doesn't give you carte blanche freedom to just treat other people terribly.
It gets simple, but I'm sorry, Ryan, go ahead.
This conversation reminds me of a passage in Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And after the concentration camp in which he was imprisoned was liberated, he was walking through a field with another of the survivors. And he noticed that his Confederate trampled on some flowers in the field. And Victor called him out on that. It's like, you shouldn't step on the flowers. And his friend was angry. And he said, after everything that we've been through, after all of the death and all of the destruction, you're going to upbraid me for trampling on some flowers that don't even have feelings? It's like, and Victor was firm. He said that, no amount of suffering that you can experience entitles you to the ability or the immunity to inflict suffering on other living creatures. But I do think that does seem to be a part of the trauma response, is this sort of like entitlement. And maybe it has to do with correcting some sense of universal injustice, that this has been done to me. And so I now, in some level, get the opportunity to do it to others. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's rational, but I do see it all the time in the syndrome of trauma. I guess I'll just say that without making a moral judgment about it. It seems to be part and parcel with the traumatized experience.
Yeah.
Thoughts are simple but profound. So both of you, thanks so much. Much appreciated.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for the question, John. Anybody else? I could talk to Alexander for days, but I want to make sure that your questions get answered. So think about that while we still have a few more minutes. What would I say to you? Wow. I think that we have some pretty different ideas about how to make relationships succeed. You clearly are very insightful and articulate and self-aware, and I imagine that your partner is as well. And I think that correct me if I'm wrong, if this is an overstatement, but I don't think that you could be in a relationship with a woman who could not meet you at this level. You clearly are a courageous communicator, and you're fair and direct and have very high standards for yourself and others. Did you have a lot of experience dating other women before you met your partner, where you didn't have this ability to connect? Or have you always been able to just, in your words, like hold women to a higher standard and they would respond?
My dating experience was limited. I was more casual. So this was probably my first proper relationship. There was a girl I was dating on and off again, and I would hold things back and try and be stoic, and it did not work. And I didn't have the means to communicate what I was going through. My parents were going through a divorce at the time. I was a bit of a mess kind of going forth. Here's what I would also say, though, is that there's a danger in assuming that there's something unique about me and that expresses this relationship, because I think we're even seeing here in the discussion between your members that this is, in my perspective, it's a muscle that you build. It's a skill that you develop. And if you tell men that women aren't capable of meeting you there, they're never going to put the reps in to actually develop it. When you first try it, you're probably going to fuck up a couple of times. But the reason why I'm able to be a courageous communicator, thank you for that compliment, is because of years of practice. So men, practice.
I just read Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud, and not all of his ideas have stood the test of time, but I think he was very insightful. And one of the things he talks about is that the basis of respect is fear, But rather than fear of some sort of angry, punitive response, he believes that the primary fear is the loss of love. And I found that to be, in my own personal experience, the most effective lever to move change in a relationship. Rather than talk about stuff, to just, in a strategic and measured way, to remove the good love that you've been providing in that relationship. And that often leads to more and better behavior change than having deep, drawn out discussions, in my own personal experience. What do you think to that?
Oh, I actually think that's dangerous, because you're attempting to influence somebody's behavior by threatening to take away something that's valuable to them. I think I take more of an ACT therapy approach and try and communicate to a woman how a course of action is in alignment with her own stated values. And so that every new piece of change that she does is an expression of herself. And so if she imagines herself to be a caring, compassionate, nurturing, feminine individual, which all women self-identify with, what you need to do is link the lack of empathy that she's showing towards you towards a failure of her living up to her own values. I found that to be a consistent, much more reliable motivator than what you just described, which is almost like threatening abandonment or something like that. I don't resonate with that.
Well, I mean, maybe it has to do with being raised in my family, and it was, my dad could talk about all kinds of things, but if he looked in the direction of the belt, that's what really motivated me to be obedient in that moment. Do you see what I'm saying? Is that there's a lot of talk about this, but often it's carrots and sticks that move the needle.
I mean, you don't want obedience from your partner, though, right? You want love. I have no interest in Emily being obedient towards me. Like, I want her to be, I want her to love me. I don't know if he's contemplating things or if I've said something very profound, or if he's frozen again. Richard, why don't you save us here? Jump in with your question.
You can't, am I frozen? You can't hear me?
You're impersonating Elsa again in Arendelle. You're doing the frozen thing, but no, you're back now.
Oh, yeah, I'm back. Okay. Oh, geez, I'm sorry.
Should I go ahead, or I
I
already
mean,
asked, but
I guess, yeah, go for it,
all
Richard.
right, I'll try and keep it brief because I know you have to leave, and I'm respecting your time as well. In terms of just the thought I had about expressing vulnerability as a man to women, and generally being more emotional, expressing vulnerability. First of all, it's certainly struck that it is a very modern conceit, right? It's almost impossible to imagine it being a 19th century conceit, as an example. And Orion mentioned last time he had a friend, I've told other people this anecdote, that there are actually 3 genders, not 2: females, high value men, and low value men. So there's something, the Pareto principle, which is kind of an 80-20 rule. And this is actually statistically proven, like this is true. 80% of the women on dating apps are messaging 20% of the men, the 20% of the top tier. So this is factually true, right? So whenever I hear the phrase or the meme or whatever you want to call it of men need to open up and be more vulnerable, I think it's just really important. And what's really been damaging to me personally, and I believe men in general, is understanding that women are referring to those 20%. The 80% are at best invisible and at worst detested. So this is where the massive problem I feel about this tenor of expressing emotion, because 100% of men hear this in our society today. And I can say with pretty good certainty that those 80% of men, particularly in the beginning of their relationship, this is not going to end well. If you're in the 20% and in an emotionally developed relationship, absolutely, there's 100% of nuance. But this to me is really a big, massive danger. And I think just a big warning flag that men need to know about.
Cool. So I disagree with you, and let me explain why. But I do want to reiterate, just in case we do run out of time, how much I've enjoyed talking to you, Richard, and all of you guys here. It's a great community. It reminds me very much of the Hero Circle community that I run. I run weekly men's discussion groups where we go through. To be honest, they're not usually as like adversarial as this has felt like, or I feel like I'm disagreeing with everybody all over the place. But this is because you guys aren't, I don't know if you guys watch my channel. The guys who are in my audience, they tend to generally understand where I'm coming from, but I've enjoyed it.
That's why I brought you on, Alexander, is I know that we don't have to agree on everything. And that's totally, I want to have a divergent opinion, and I respect and appreciate your perspective. So thank you for having the courage and the respect to disagree with me and the other people here in a respectful way.
No worries. Thank you. I appreciate that. I feel less like some interloper foreigner who's just come in and just told everybody why they're fucking wrong or whatever. Well, as you can see, I'm passionate about this. So what I'd say, Richard, is that I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the Pareto principle as it applies in relationships here, in that you're thinking that the kind of vulnerability that I'm talking about expressing from women and holding standards is only something reserved for that top 20% of men. What I would say is that in order to make it into that top 20% of men, you have to be demanding this kind of accountability. These kinds of this is how you get there, right? Like if you're a low value man, then you feel like, who am I to hold a woman accountable for her lack of empathy? Who am I to hold standards for how she should treat me in a relationship? If you want to become one of those top quality guys, this is the kind of behavior you need to go. Maybe you're not a top 20% guy, you're a top 40% guy. But guess what? The top 40% guy who suddenly grows a backbone and a spine and some self-esteem that says, hey, you want the privilege of being in a relationship with me? These are the standards that you have to meet. You have to show empathy. You have to show support. Not good enough. You want to deflect the conversation and just avoid this topic? No, I demand more. And then suddenly you take on a new level of masculinity that places you from that 40% to that 20%. So I don't think you're viewing that principle correctly.
Okay, thank you for your question, Richard. I want to be respectful of your time, Alexander. Thank you so much for joining us today. I feel inspired by your perspective. There are certain things that I would like to try out in my own relationship after this conversation to see how they go. You know, just like I started this conversation with a huge admirer of your work over the years, and thank you for really diving into. I mean, what's interesting from like a process perspective is that this conversation, I think, in my experience, it mirrors what you're advocating men to do. I thought it was very vulnerable. You stated your real opinion. You showed your authentic emotion. And I believe that you felt that this was it's overused, but like a safe place, a holding place for you to be able to express that without recrimination or judgment. And I think that even leaving aside the content of our conversation, the way that happened would be instructive to a lot of people in this conversation. Would you agree?
Yeah, I've got to address that. It's very kind words. Thank you, everybody. And what I'd say is that part of the anger that you might experience from me is this point of whatever vulnerability you've watched from me in this call. I would not buy into anybody shaming me for it. That's how sure of myself I am. You know, at what point could they suddenly say, like, Alex, you shouldn't be feeling that way. You shouldn't be thinking that. You shouldn't be expressing. Well, why not? It's my life, right? Like, why can't I do whatever I want? You know, these are my standards. If you don't like it, you don't have to stay on the call. You don't have to stay in a relationship with me or whatever. So what I encourage everybody listening to this to do is just to reflect upon this inside yourself. What emotions do you feel inside yourself are unacceptable? And why do you feel that way? Is it because they're genuinely unacceptable? Or is it because at some point in your childhood or in this mainstream culture, you were told that you're not okay the way that you are, that it's not okay for you to be struggling, okay to you have negative emotions? And whose benefit is to that? Is it to your benefit to repress that? Or you just continue to shame and repress yourself for the comfort of everybody else? That's fucked up. That's not okay. You are the valuable person. You're the hero of your own life. You know, we're all going to die. And there's no afterlife. Sorry again to offend the religious people, but this is the one life you get. Do not waste it. Do not waste it. Fucking own yourself and really live the way that you're meant to live. That's the message. Yeah.
I think that's very, very well said, man. I'll leave it at that because that was very articulate. And thank you so much for coming on today. I hope I can return the favor, and I hope that we can continue to talk in the days ahead. I know you got to run, so I'll follow up with you personally after this call just to debrief if you'd like. But thank you everyone for joining us today and your good questions. It really helped to propel the discussion forward. Alexander, once again, thank you for your time. A real pleasure.
No worries. Can you send me the recording? I might post it on my Patreon.
I will. Again, I apologize for the connectivity issues. So it's going to be fragmented, but I will get that to you in the next few days. Okay, Alexander?
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Much love.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll talk soon. Our next meeting will be in a week, right? So the first Captain's Quarters group discussion of March will occur on the 4th at our usual time of 5:30 p.m. Pacific. I hope to see you there. Thank you for joining us today. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Good night, y'all.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.